What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'll be showing you how to upload files from your Raspberry Pi Pico W to Amazon S3. That is a storage system in the cloud that allows you to store a large amount of files, very large files such as CSVs, images, and even simple files that you can use to manage an IoT application. And it's really popularly used across all full stack applications. So we'll be using Amazon S3 in this video, and I'll be showing you can send files over the internet from your Raspberry Pi Pico W because, as you know, this thing doesn't have much storage, so you can only save a certain amount of files on it. And also, it's a nice way to have a centralized location for all your files, especially if you have a distributed application, which hopefully eventually you get advanced to the point where your application is scaled and distributed enough. And S3 is a great tool to help scale your application. So we'll be jumping into that in this video. And so the technology stack we'll be using in this video before we get into it, we're using MicroPython on the Raspberry Pi Pico W, as you can see here, with a very simple script. And in between the Raspberry Pi Pico W and S3, we'll be using a simple back-end Node.js layer that will have the S3 SDK, which will allow us to manage operations on the S3 bucket. Because unfortunately, there's no way with the small storage on the Raspberry Pi Pico W that we can download any SDK related to S3. So we have to develop an intermediate layer, which I'll be showing you in this video, to manage the information before we send it to S3 so we can properly use an SDK that will give us access to S3 and allow us to do other sorts of operations if we like as well. So don't worry, it sounds a little complicated, but trust me, it's very simple MicroPython code and JavaScript code and Node.js. And I'll be walking you over step by step exactly of how to do this. So before we get into the actual high-level explanation of the code and the infrastructure, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe to the channel, and even better, consider donating to the channel as always in the link down below. So we're just going to jump straight into it here. Let's get started. Okay, so as you can see, I'm in my MicroPython environment connected to my Raspberry Pi Pico W on the bottom right there. And we just have this simple Python script or MicroPython script we're going to run on our Raspberry Pi Pico W. So in this MicroPython script, we're just having a series of imports here, which we'll talk about in a second, but you do have to have all these imports. And we have these constants defined. So we have our internet name, our internet password, and the backend URL. This is currently what is hosted on the internet for my backend node server. We'll talk about more of this in the second step. Do not be intimidated by that. It's honestly really simple, but we'll talk about how to get this backend URL. And we also have the local text file path we want to upload. In this case, I have a very simple text file we're going to upload today to S3. But honestly, this is kind of a useless case because S3 can take much more complicated and useful data than that, and you can store large amounts of data. So that's just a dummy file. Essentially, we're going to verify that we're uploading the correct thing, and that is just the path to that file. And also for these configs, you can just essentially hard code them here if you want, but I just left them in this config file just for some security purposes for my internet connection. And it's typically good practice to have constants in a config file, but really you can just delete that and hard code the actual string there, which is fine. So in this script, it's just one function we are running, just one simple function that we are connecting to the internet in the first part. So that's all we're doing here, is we're just initiating a connection to our local Wi-Fi. And in the next try block, we're doing a read of that file in bytes. So we're just reading it, okay? And then we're doing some base 64 encoding and just doing some minor processing before we send it across the HTTP request. And we are setting the headers of the HTTP post request because we are posting to an HTTP endpoint, which will be hosted on our server. It's a very simple endpoint, which we will discuss in the next step. And then we just attach the payload, as you can see here. So we just call it text data. And then we use the UR request.post library to post to that URL with the payload and with the headers. And then we just expect a response, and then we close the response. And if there's any exception, we print the exception. And finally, we disconnect to Wi-Fi, which is good practice. So that is all that is going on in the script. So we're just going to hit the HTTP endpoint we define. We'll talk about how we get this endpoint later on. And one important thing is this gc.collect. So this is also important because this library allows you to do garbage collection, which sometimes I realize if we're dealing with images and we're not doing garbage collection, this Raspberry Pi Pico W can run out of memory. if we keep running this back to back. So make sure you run gc.collect if you're dealing with larger files, especially image files, because you can run into image issues. So make sure you have this code on your device, as you can see here. And we're just going to jump into the Node.js side of things to show you how to set up a server and host a server. And then we will reconfigure this endpoint based on the server name endpoint. So let's jump into the Node side. Okay, we're going to jump into Visual Studio Code here to create and manage our Node project as our IDE, our preferred choice of IDE, but really you can use any IDE you want. I just really like Visual Studio Code for working with Node projects. So we are going to create our Node project here, and if it's your first time working with Node, essentially it's a server-side framework that allows you to easily set up and create web servers, which we're going to do, to have the S3 SDK on our web server, our Node server, so that we can interact with the S3 clients. Okay, so if you haven't installed Node, you could just go to nodejs.org. It's really easy to install. And once you do that, I'm in Visual Studio Code. We can just go ahead and create an empty directory. I'm just going on my computer, and I could just call it Raspberry Pico W backend. Okay, so this is the one we are going to work with. Okay, so Raspberry Pi Pico W backend. Really, you can create the directory wherever you want. This is just where we will initialize our Node project. So let's go ahead and open that. So, okay, so Raspberry Pi Pico W backend. So we're just going to open that. It should be an empty directory. And we just want to, first things first, we want to initialize a Node project. So we could just do npm init. Okay. Now we could just click through these. You don't really need these unless you're actually serious about this project and you want to go to production, so fill those in. But for the sake of this video, we don't have to fill that information in. Next thing we want to do is we want to create the actual server code. So it's a very simple server with essentially one main endpoint. So we can just go here, call it server.js. Okay. By the way, you can name it whatever you want. It just has to be a JavaScript file, or I believe a TypeScript file. And then once you have that, we're just going to copy and paste the code from this other screen and go over it at a high level. So this is all the server code we'll be running that will be managing the requests from our Raspberry Pi Pico W. So just walking through this. So we just have some imports we require to manage some HTTP requests and the body of the HTTP request. And the main thing here, what we want to focus on is this S3 client. So this S3 client is why we're using this middle layer, Node.js, because we can easily install this by just running npm install, and we could just install this package here, okay, for the project. And of course, the other packages as well. So we can also install Express and body parser. And also, let me zoom in for you guys. Sorry, I always forget to do this. Let me just zoom in one more. Let's see. There, okay, let me zoom out a little more. Let's zoom in a little for you guys just so it's clear for everyone. So as you can see here, just installing the 3 packages I am using, so that's fine. Make sure you do that. And it's really easy to install those, just npm I, the name of the packages separated by space. And so yes, this is the main thing that is going to help us interact with S3. So we have the client we're importing, and we're importing this put object command. Mind you, there are many other commands from this SDK that you can use, such as get object and many other commands. But in the sake of this video, we're just going to put an object into the S3 bucket. So that's all we have to import from there. And what's important here is we have to substitute the corresponding information. So the region, the access key ID, and the secret access key ID, or the secret access key, which I'll show you how to create that in a second. And of course, the only other thing is the name of the bucket. So if it's your first time working with AWS S3, you can easily just go to s3.aws.com. Just search AWS S3, create an account. It is free to get started. And then once you're into the s3.console.aws.com, I already have a bucket and I already have a user configured, but I'm just going to show you exactly how to get the corresponding information. You could just go search up here S3, and you can click S3, and it's going to take you here, the screen we're just at, and you can just create a bucket. And as you can see, the default region is US East 2, so that's the region we're going to use. You can change the region based on what you want to change the region as. And then we could just call it AWS Pico W bucket, anything you want. And there's so many settings in AWS. Honestly, it's a whole course in itself, but we could just create the base bucket. That's fine for the sake of this video. I'm not going to use the bucket. I'm going to use the previous bucket I already created. But that just shows you it's really easy to create a bucket, and we could start sending things to the bucket first after we create a user. So you can't start using it right away. You actually have to create a user who has the permissions to add things or do things with this bucket. So the user I'm using for my backend right now is called that dude. I was just being a little silly, but we can create another user simply by just going here. We just call it serious dude or something, you know, something more serious. And then we just go to next here. And so it's really easy to create a user, and we could just click next. We'll worry about these groups in a second. Those groups are very important. So we could just create user. Okay. So right now we have a user, but this user doesn't have any access to anything really. So we have to add them to a group, and this group will give them different access. And groups are really important when you want to manage different people across your team who have different access. You don't want everyone to have pseudo access to a bucket. That could be dangerous, or to S3. So we are just going to go, we clicked into the user, serious dude, and we're just going to go here, add user to groups. And we're just going to create a new group. Okay, so I already have a bunch of administrator groups. We'll just create a new group. Let's call it new group. Once again, I'm not going to use this. I'm just showing you how to get to the point where I am at, because I already have a group and a user, but it's the same process. Just showing you how to do it here. So we'll just give them administrator access for this. Okay. New group already exists. Okay, Pico W. All right. And then we'll just add them to that new group, Pico W. All right. And that is, okay, so it looks like that user is now in that group. And the last thing you have to do is once you add them to that administrator group, is you simply have to generate an access key. So that's the two pieces of information you saw. Okay, so it's an application running outside AWS. This doesn't really matter for now. We could just call it whatever. And we are just going to get the access key and the secret access key. So one important thing here is once you exit this page, you won't have access to the secret access key. So you will need it, so save this locally and keep it safe, so because it's very private information, and the access key as well. So you need those, and once you have those, you can just substitute the access key in the secret access key, and then the name of the bucket here, and then you can run this server. So what this server is essentially doing is just configuring some things with Express and body parser, and we have two very simple endpoints in the server. Okay. So we have this test endpoint. This is just to make sure the server is up and running. A lot of servers have test endpoints just for like a health check. So we just have that. And then we have this main endpoint here, which is this upload endpoint. So this is the endpoint that's going to take that request from the Raspberry Pi Pico W. Okay. So it's going to extract binary data in the form of text data in this case. And it's going to validate that it does have data there. Otherwise, it's going to return an invalid request. And it's going to do some buffering of that text. It's going to create a text file. Okay, so this is the file name we're going to use in AWS. It has a text underscore the date, so it's good to give it a unique name. And then we just have these parameters. So that is the bucket name as discussed, the file name, and the body. So this is just the information in text. So just three simple parameters for that. And then yeah, we just use the S3 client.send method on the S3 clients, and we use put object command. We pass the parameters. And if we did everything right with the S3 bucket, we should get this to work correctly if we have all the correct access key information and the bucket and the region. Okay, so now that we have that, we're going to run this locally for now, but actually we're going to go a step above that. We're not only going to run it locally, we're going to run it on the cloud in GCP. So I'm going to show you how to do that. But first, just to make sure for a sanity check that it's running correctly, in Node, you can run a server very easily just by typing node server.js. And you can see the server is running locally. So if you did something wrong there, you'll probably get some import errors or some error if you miscopied the code or played something. But it's typically good to run it locally just to make sure it's not breaking before we do the next step, which we're going to deploy this intermediate layer to Google Cloud, which thankfully is also free to get started with, and it's going to be a very simple back end. And the reason we're doing that is because we want this middle layer to be accessible anywhere on the internet. So if this Raspberry Pi Pico W, if you join another network that's not your local network, this is a great way to essentially have this server accessible from anywhere where you have Wi-Fi. So let's jump into the steps to get this thing on GCP so we can hit the endpoint from our Raspberry Pi Pico W. Okay, so in order to get started with GCP, that is Google Cloud, you simply want to search Google Cloud Console, and you want to click here and go through the steps to create an account. I already have an account. I believe it is free to get started. If they do ask you for billing, don't panic. I mean, even if they do bill you, we're creating such a small server. Well, they'll probably charge you in pennies, maybe not even, but I'm pretty sure there is a free tier. I've been using this for more than a year, so I'm past that free tier. And then once we are in Google Cloud, what we're going to do is the first thing is we're going to be in this console, as you can see, and we are going to create a new project. So you could just go and click create new project from the top there and give it a name. And as you can see, I have 3 projects. The one we're going to be working with today is just this Raspberry Pi Pico W backend. So I'm just going to click into that. I already went through the steps to create a new project. It's just going to ask you for a name. And the next thing we want to do, and obviously there's a lot going on in GCP. It could be a little overwhelming, but we're just going to focus on one small aspect of it, and that is the app engine portion, where it will allow us to deploy an app very easily. So in order to deploy that app, we have to download a small tool. So we have to download the GCloud CLI. So we have to install this SDK. I'm going to link this in the description down below, but they have the steps to install it per your system. So if you're on a Mac, they have the steps for a Mac, a Windows, a Linux, and other machines. And so you can just go through these steps, pretty straightforward. And you should have the GCloud CLI. So after you have the GCloud CLI and you have a project created in GCP with your GCP account, next thing you want to do is you just want to go back here. So we're going to use the GCloud CLI. So you just type in GCloud. We're going to type in init to initialize. So I already created a project before. So what we could do here is it says reinitialize this configuration with new settings or create a new configuration. Let's just create a new configuration. And we could just call this configuration, I don't know, like project 1 config. Project 1 config. Okay. Let's just do that. It's going to take a moment there. So choose the account you would like to. So we could just do my email, which is fine. And then we could pick the project. So we're going to do 3 there, Raspberry Pi Pico W backend. Okay, the one we just created. So just enter the number here. I don't know why it's behaving really weirdly. So that's weird. Okay, so I'm gonna enter 3 now. If for some reason it didn't let me hit back on the keyboard, so just enter the one you want to. In this case, for me, that's 3. And so now we could run GCloud commands with that project configured. Okay. Now the next thing we want to do is we just want to deploy this backend. So it's very easy once you have it initialized. So let's just go ahead and first of all, you have to create a app.yaml file. So app.yaml, I believe it's called. Let me make sure I did that right. So this is essentially, yes, so this is the file that contains the information for the machine. So the parameters of the machine you're going to deploy on. And the parameters I have here, we're not going to go into them too much, but this is a very lightweight and inexpensive machine designed, as you can see here, for test, essentially. It's not really a production level machine because we're using very little CPU and memory, and we are just very unscalable. So we have max instances of 1. If you are going to production, you probably want to research more about this app YAML. And the runtime we're using is NodeJS. It's just standard environment. An operating system is Ubuntu 22. That's fine. So once we have the app.yaml, what we could do now, I haven't done this in a while, hopefully I'm doing it right here, is we can just GCloud. I think we could just deploy it to that project name. Okay, so we can just do app deploy. As you can see, I deployed to a previous project before, but we can just deploy to the Raspberry Pi Pico W backend project. And actually, let me just go copy the name of the project here. Let's copy it from the URL. Okay. I haven't done this in a couple weeks, actually. Looks like I'm doing the right thing. So we just want to deploy to that project because you could have more than one project. And also we just want to deploy version 1. So one thing will happen is if you deploy without this version 1, it'll keep deploying a new version. And that's not good because you don't want to have a bunch of versions. And the more versions, if you actually are paying for this, it'll cost more money. So you could run into an issue if you have a bunch of versions you're not using. Let's go ahead and do that. And it's asking you the region. I mean, I don't really care personally. I think for now it's fine. We could just do US East, like the S3 bucket. I mean, all of them are pretty similar. Obviously, we probably want to do more research into these, but I'm just going to delete this after the video anyways. So let's just do Let's just do Central because I am in Central, so 17. And it is creating App Engine application and project Raspberry Pi Pico W backend in the region. And we can just say yes. Okay, file uploaded. So this will take some time, just let it upload. And once that's done, we'll jump to the portion of the video where your node is uploaded. So if this runs successfully, it will be good. Okay, so awesome. After a few minutes, it looks like our app deployed successfully to GCP. So it gave us that back end point that we see here. So you should get the same thing. Obviously, it depends on your name, your app name. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to copy that in, and we're going to go to our MicroPython code. And I remember at the beginning I mentioned we're going to have to change this backend URL, so we can actually do that now. And we could just remove this config. We don't have to do it in the config file. So we just copy in. We could do the slash up or the / upload because that is the extension we're going to use. That is the endpoint we defined in our node project. Just delete that and save it. But before we actually run this code, the last thing I just want to show you is you can easily see what's going on with this app. If you search App Engine up here, you could search App Engine and you can click App Engine. And pretty much it shows you different information about the app, such as logs and other rules you can define. So you could see we deployed the first version with the runtime and the service count and that sort of thing. So you could see all the logs and other parameters you want to configure with this app by just going to search App Engine and seeing that version you deployed. Okay, so it looks like it's up and running, which is awesome. And one thing we can also do here is, see, it allows us to actually click that, and that is the base URL of the app. And we could hit the / test endpoint to make sure our server is working. So as you can see, it is working. So server is working, perfect. So now if we actually run this code in MicroPython on the Raspberry Pi Pico W, we should see a file that is uploaded. So let's go ahead and run this. Okay. So give it a second here. So uploading text file to back end. Looks like everything is good. It should take a little bit of time. So it looks like it did upload successfully. Let's go and make sure that this text file with this date is in S3. Let's go and let's just search AWS S3. And let's go here and let's click that bucket. And we could see the objects in, actually, that's actually the wrong bucket. Let's go to the one we defined before, because the new bucket was just a dummy bucket just to show you. We can see that it did create that text file. Awesome. And there was a couple samples before because I hit it a few times just to make sure it worked for the sake of the video. And we could just go ahead and open it and open the text file. We see it does hello world. So that is it end to end. So I know it was a lot of steps and it was a lot going on, but I hope I clearly defined it for you to show you how to upload something to S3 from the Raspberry Pi Pico W with a series of steps. Very simple middleware essentially that we created, which the middleware in this case was a Node.js backend deployed on GCP. And we had some other layers such as the S3 layer and of course our Raspberry Pi Pico W code running MicroPython to hit that endpoint. A lot of steps, but I think it's a very powerful way to enhance your IoT applications. I hope you learned something new. I know we went over a lot, so let me know in the comment section down below if you have any questions about any of the steps. Stay tuned, guys. Thanks for watching and take it easy. All the information will be linked down in the description below from all the links I discussed. So if there's anything missing, let me know, and I'll see you next time.